Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Graduate Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. This episode features a discussion about what is happening in the United States at the moment following the death of George Floyd during his arrest by police in Minneapolis last week. This discussion focuses on why this continues to happen, what is needed to change the situation, and is this a police brutality issue or is it more about human rights? My guests for this episode are Mohamed Mahmoud Mohamedou, Professor of International History and Chair of the International History Department at the Graduate Institute, and Davide Rodogno, Professor of International History at the Graduate Institute. What happened to George Floyd last week is unfortunately another example in a long line of similar incidents in the US over the past decades. Many of these incidents have led to riots as well. For example, Oakland 2009, Ferguson 2014, Baltimore 2015, etc., etc. Why does this continue, and what will it take to change?
Well, it continues because it simply has not been solved. It hasn't been dealt with. And we have this outlook on these events, the series of events. And you're right, there's quite a long sort of list of such riots, quote unquote. I think we should also think about how these are termed in another part of the world that be called rebellions, that be called uprisings for rights, for democracy. So the whole riots language is also itself coded. But I think it continues in this way because it simply has not been dealt with. And this raises the fundamental question of racism in the United States as a systemic and historical question. And I think for me, these are the two fundamental aspects that tend to be sort of lost in translation when it's covered as current affairs, as simply the story of this particular cop and this victim or this city or that community. When what you have is a steady stream since about, the end of slavery, technically the whole sort of so-called Jim Crow laws, giving into the segregation era, giving into this series of riots since the 60s all the way to now, and as an unresolved question. What's arresting is how both the United States actually, but more so around the world, there's a perception that this has been dealt with, that somehow it's been solved, right? And because of this perception of having addressed it, we kind of wake up, this is now strange that this is happening, or it's a bit more of the same in that history. When in fact, the whole sequence is quite continuous on this theme of non-resolution.
The problem is endemic. It has not been addressed. That's it. And the way media presents it is profoundly wrong, because this collage of events or the focus on just the latest iteration of it. And so, maybe we go back to 2015 or 2012, etc. Doesn't really help. And this is problematic. As Mahmoud said a second ago, there is yet another issue, is the way we talk about it, the way we define it. And this is highly problematic. So the problem is endemic. And it's if you look at it on the longue durée, it has been there persistently. It has not been addressed or addressed only on the surface. And we talk about it, we deal with it, media present, and also the way images on TV or social media are used and abused are not there to help.
This is mainly seen as a police brutality or abuse issue. How come this isn't seen as a human rights issue?
Well, I think that's exactly the change of paradigm we need. And I think we'll get there in time. I think I see sort of the beginning of an international conversation of this. It's very, very embryonic. But you see that there's a perception among some of these movements building up very recently, actually. In the past couple of weeks after this incident, we have seen quite the regular kind of starstruck perception from the rest of the world, but now gradually we're seeing that these movements are picking up. It is not precisely because of what we were saying. It has tended to be read as something very discrete, very specific to the US, as part of an ongoing sort of civil rights moment. And this is really the problem with that history. Those events of the mid-60s were so powerful, were so sort of enshrined in that history, and also codified the acts that were adopted, and all of this kind of moment of the Vietnam War, the assassinations, all of that is sort of reached a high point. And there's been since then kind of a letdown in thinking that this has been dealt with and that we have entered a different moment and that the country is somewhere else. When what you do have is all along a set of communities, right? Specifically the African American one, but I think this also now connects to the Latino community, to the Muslim community after 9/11, to the so-called sort of white trash community. You get all of this kind of class aspects that is related to this. What you do have now is a sense that these sort of spatial dimensions, living in specific neighborhoods, educational aspects, lack of access to job opportunities, lack of representation on a national scale in terms of power, in terms of balance, in terms of elections. Yes, Obama was elected, but that's sort of precisely sort of almost kind of a reaction to that history by saying, look, we can have this person elected. And by the way, nothing changed during his presidency as a matter of all of that. So all of these questions are matters of what I would call a lacking social contract. I think the social contract in the United States is still a work in progress. I think this is a matter of going back to those discussions, addressing that, and building onto what, now to your point, the international community has been defining as international, as a corpus of international human rights. And so speaking in matters of existing acts, speaking in matters of the very terminology of accountability, representation, right? Opportunities that these communities should have as we discuss it vis-a-vis any community around the world. I think we have to change the outlook about this whole question.
The problem is that we've been there. We've been there in the 1960s. So there was a trend back then when an issue that was a human rights issue, a civil rights issue, for a number of reasons related to the Vietnam War and many other things that Mahmoud referred to, became led to an international, transnational interest in the question, right? And then it is as if this momentum, for a number of other reasons, 1970s, oil crisis, etc., evaporated. The problem was not addressed, as we said before. And it was narrated, the story we hear was as if the problem had been solved, right? Now, what I tend to see today, Mahmoud was referring to the breaking up of the social contract, or the social contract in the making. Social contracts are in the making in many other places. But this is such a deep fracture, is such a deep problem in that particular society that unless it is addressed thoroughly, is going to persist and to create further divisions. It will depend on who is going to be the next president. If the president is the same and he fuels this kind of discourse, it's only going to get worse. A few months ago, I thought that because of the sanitary problem, because of COVID-19, you might have seen this kind of uprisings, riots, etc., which are also related to discriminations and people not having access to very basic health needs. It was not directly related to that, but it's part of the same problem, which seems not to be addressed. And one wonders if this is done in a deliberate way, because after a while, you start wondering, because in the end, what is the percentage of African Americans in the USA? 12%? Roughly. Okay. So we're talking about a tiny minority. And when a problem like this is not addressed for so long, for a relative small minority if you consider how big is the country, then you can start asking yourself further questions, which are not particularly nice questions.
And that minority is overrepresented, as we know, in rates of prison incarceration, for instance, and many other things where this ratio becomes problematic. Davide touched on a key aspect, which is the question of leadership. When you look at, to your first question, when you look at how to address this, you do have to go back to the systemic nature of this. So it's above and beyond the individual leaders, right? So it becomes a question of, as we said, social contract, nation, history, what kind of destiny or what kind of project do you envision for yourself? It's a larger sort of undertaking, and the continuity of this raises these questions that we mentioned of healthcare, education, all of these matters from one generation to the other. Nonetheless, in matters of politics, in matters of community, leadership has a role to play. And what we have seen is that all of a steady stream of presidents really have not helped, and particularly in the recent period. Now, we have seen this, of course, in the earlier phases, right, from the era of racist presidents explicitly, sort of the 19th and early 20th century, to those that opened up a little bit to possibility in JFK and beyond and Johnson. But from the Nixon era forward, you do have this kind of cycle. Now, currently, I think what we do have to say is that the current president, Mr. Trump, has not made things easier to solve this. Quite the opposite. I happen to think explicitly that this is a racist president, that he has spoken in those very terms vis-a-vis the communities whose president he is. So by virtue of having this negative exemplarity, you do, to your point, Davide, you do create even more of a rift within the communities who happen to be systemically almost kind of programmed sort of to stay away from each other because of this history, right? So now you come and you give license in the very manner that he has done recently, not to mention, and we have to say this, the militarization of how the police are engaging with what we have as peaceful demonstrators.
If I may add something on this point, or in Tomasi di Lampedusa, the Gepard, there is this sentence, tutto cambia perché nulla cambi. Everything has to change for things to remain the same. This seems to follow, these last events of the last few days seem to follow a very well-known pattern, okay? Somebody's killed, an African American is killed, people protest, fires, riots, police reacts, social media. Now you have celebrities who have blackened their right. We've been there before, and it seems to me that political leaders, policymakers know this way better than we do. And this is going to last a few days, and in the end, nothing is going to change. And so it's back to business as usual. And this is the real problem, because we will forget and move on to the next crisis, and so that actually the system can thrive as it is and perpetuate itself. And this is very bad news.
I'd like to focus on something that was just mentioned, the point about this situation will last for a few days, but nothing will change in the end. It's going to be business as usual. Is the United States too divided at the moment to really get together and solve this?
It's a story in the story. The country has been divided since the election of Mr. Trump, clearly. This is a moment in history where you could see that the result of that election, in the manner it came about, in the way it was disputed. So regardless of the race question, you have a problem on that. But the divide itself has been racialized by the very actions of this president. The tropes, the language, you spoke about narratives earlier, all of these were part of a script. Now remember that this is a president who comes from television. He's very familiar with this. He knows the impact, and from business. So the narrative is not only controlled, it's also very much essentially staged in that way. And so what you have is a country that finds itself in the throes of this divide and having to work with it. But when we say division, we have also tended, you spoke earlier of having a certain aspect of this being almost fatalistic about this whole history of the United States, that this divide is there and can never be transcended. Well, the US is a young country, and in his key work on democracy in America, de Tocqueville speaks about the fact that it has the privilege of being able to make mistakes and fix them, as opposed to ancient nations that carry so much history as such. And I think there's a certain dynamism in that history, in that society, that should come up alive today. And I do believe that it's going to get worse before it gets better, but I think the country can bounce back as a result of this particular history. But the point that you made is fundamental. That bouncing back, that transcending, that resolution cannot happen if the cycle is allowed every time to simply be narrated or playing out in that way. And so it will end with the prosecution or not of this particular cop, and then we move on, and then we have several other episodes, when we've seen this movie too often in recent years particularly.
Yeah, and precisely, we have seen, but this president and this administration have seen this movie as well. And as a historian, what I would like to say is that we should never underestimate these kind of leaders, precisely because they know as well as we do how to read news. And this is equally important because he and his advisors know very well how to navigate these troubled waters and to get out from the crisis in the way they want to be out of the crisis, which is, of course, not the way we would like the crisis to end and the page to be turned, so to say. And this is what I find particularly important in times of extreme or significant polarization of society or societies.
Over the past few days, we've seen protests not only in the US, but in Toronto, London, Berlin, Auckland, among other cities. Many of these protests are being done in solidarity with US crowds. However, this is not just a US problem, is it?
Yeah, and I think it's good news that this is happening. I think it's, frankly, too little too late. I think there's been too much international passivity, including on the part of the youth, whom we've seen very engaged in questions of the environment, for instance, or health recently. And I say this because these are the type of issues, causes we used to call them, where 30, 40 years ago you would have spontaneous demonstrations, marches around the world in support for this particular country that is colonized or that leader that has been killed. You had a moment where sort of the social consciousness and awareness, which is still existing, right, was more diffuse, more international. And yet paradoxically, under globalization, you have some of these questions that are very much localized, Arab Spring here, Gilets jaunes over there, Hong Kong question, and so on. They speak to each other. But some of the themes that have to be international, and racism is one of them, paradoxically has been missing. And so I see that this very, very recent kind of awakening, I think, is a good sign. I think it's logically a human reaction to injustice. In the face of injustice, people are saying, well, as we were discussing, this cannot go on and we need to move forward. But I think the larger point, and this goes back to what we do here and what we teach and what we research, the question of racism itself has been basically missing out of international relations. In the curricula, in the thinking, in research, it's dealt with in a very kind of discrete manner or overly technically or quantified or statistics, right? What I mean by that is that it has always been an issue of our times, and today it's essentially jumping at us as we see. The US is a vivid example because of what we've been saying about its history. But you can say the same about France, its relation with Muslims. You could say the same about Germany, where neo-Nazis are sort of being more active. You could say the same about Italy, what we're seeing a lot of neo-fascism coming back. You could say a lot about several other European countries. You have the same happening in places around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. The question of racial discrimination, xenophobia, how it relates to the migrants, a topic Davide knows very well, has also been essentially something we need to be looking at and addressing and putting on the agenda. And I think it's been missing. And so to see these movements taking place, I think it's good news, really.
Your question, Dan, made me think about globalization, actually, and all the wrong assumptions about this thing that it's so fluffy and malleable, and sometimes is considered as, a unidirectional kind of process going exactly in one expected direction. And the too little, too late kind of reaction that Mahmoud was referring to shows exactly the opposite. The opposite. So one could ask the question, do we have a problem with generosity? I mean, were people in the 60s way more generous and ready to, support other people in need of a political support, 40, 50 years before social media and all the rest? Today, frankly speaking, there is no justification. Or why is generosity so biased and selective? Such a huge movement of young people, protesting when it comes to environment, but being silent when it comes to racism. So if globalization is what we read very often this is about, this should not be the case. And in fact, what we see is, okay, there was a little manifestation in Berlin, in Toronto, here and there, but not only is too little too late, it is weak. It is not coordinated. It is not a strong movement that will force anybody to change anything. At least this is not the case today. I hope this will change in the future.
And it's weak because it's only part of a sequence. For change to happen, think about South Africa, for instance, in the 80s. You need this societal awareness, which would translate into action. You need as well sort of coordinated civil society work that's now more professional, right? There's some of that on racism anyway, but it's not really focused on the United States in the manner that we've been discussing. And there's a third component to this, which we certainly have not seen, which is pronouncement by decision makers. Now, think for a moment if what we're observing today in the United States was taking place in a quote-unquote faraway country in the very same manner, that a different community, not African Americans, that somehow would be related to Europeans or North Americans, whose men would be regularly killed by public authorities. You would clearly see accusations, sort of pronouncements, possibly even an embargo on these questions coming from some of the leaders who are today silent.
An intervention.
A military intervention, humanitarian intervention for that matter. I mean, think for a moment how the absence of a pronouncement by the British Prime Minister or by the French President, right? Or the German Chancellor. This is the kind of voices that are absent saying, look, this is a problem now that we have in this country that is our problem because it is an international human rights question and has to be understood in the very definition of the 1965 Act that addresses this, which is essentially to prevent people from opportunities for achievement based on preference, based on color, based on race, based on descent. These are matters that here in Geneva, precisely at the Office of the High Commissioner, we have entities whose job is to address that. And I think this dimension doesn't even come readily to the mindsets of these decision makers, and problematically, not much also among the thinking in academia itself and in research. And I think this is what we need to push a little bit to make happen.
I agree. I think that there is another issue which is related to the, I would say, the horizontality of media and information today, which leads paradoxically to further ignorance. So the news are preceded by silos. And so this connection, putting things together and going back to the 1960s, which might have been a way of saying, hey, but our fathers or grandfathers protested back then for an issue or a problem that is basically the same that we are experiencing today, many young people don't even know about it because we do not teach on it. So we go back to education, which is a point that Mahmoud raised a minute ago, which I think is part of the problem and part of our responsibility, because this is precisely what we, teachers, scholars, researchers, can do. Address in our own way, which is very limited. There are a number of things that we can do. Well, this is one of those. Address it, talk about it.
Open the minds.
That was my last question. Thank you very much to both of you for sharing your valuable insight and for participating in this episode.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was great.
That was Professor Mohamed Mahmoud Mohamedou and Professor Davide Rodogno discussing the situation following the death of George Floyd last week. This podcast series is produced by the Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Graduate Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.